My name is John Benet Ramsey, and I'm 5.5.
Mr. Moore.
Hello.
Mr. Stone, listen very carefully.
Now listen to me carefully.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to listen to almost the entire Ramsey ransom note narrated by clips from movies. Now, you may or may not be aware that the movie Ransom was actually playing in Boulder cinemas at the time. In other words, over Christmas in 1996. And according to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, that's Lawrence Schiller's book, on the night John Benet was murdered, the movie Nick of Time aired at 7:30 p.m. on a Boulder cable channel. That story also deals with an unarmed political faction that kidnaps a 6-year-old girl, and the victim is also told, "Listen to me very carefully." One of the guests staying with the Whites, Bill Cox, he was staying with Fleet and Priscilla that night, said he told the police that he remembered watching that movie that night, Nick of Time. And then we're also going to talk about the possibly startling relevance of a Star Trek movie. So what I want you to do as we go through this episode, we're going to play the audio twice. And what I want you to do is, once I've given you some of the background, I want you to go through the ransom note while you're listening and just get an idea of the scale and scope that potentially comes from several movies that were in circulation at that time and a couple that weren't, such as Dirty Harry. Now, Dirty Harry is interesting for some of the very idiosyncratic references, such as talking to a stray dog. That definitely comes up. Listen carefully. That definitely comes up. I hope you've had enough rest. That also comes up. And also those references to she dies, she dies, she dies, which also appears in the ransom note. Something that I found very surprising was the almost eerie amount that comes out of the film Ruthless People, starring Danny DeVito and Bette Midler. It came out quite a long time prior to the incident. It came out in June 1986. But just the telephone call, and this is about a wealthy businessman who wants to get rid of his wife and has her kidnapped. Just that phone call on its own is pretty amazing how similar it is to the ransom note. Now you might sort of raise an eyebrow, almost like Spock would, at the reference to foreign faction that comes out of Star Trek First Contact. You might think, well, that is crazy. But the thing is, that movie came out, I think, in November, the 22nd of November, 1996. So it was definitely at the right time. And what's interesting, in one of the scenes where he refers to a foreign faction, he has an encounter with a woman called Lily Sloan, and that is where he talks about a faction. She asks him, "Who are you with? What faction?" And he says, "I'm not with the Eastern Coalition." And then later on he talks again about a new faction that wants to prevent your launch. I think what also makes this interesting is that there was a Star Trek poster in the train room in the basement. And the other thing that I think is worth noting is that John Ramsey, when he spoke critically or cynically or disparagingly about people who suspected them, he referred to them as the Borg. And of course the Borg feature in that particular Star Trek movie that came out in late November 1996. Now, I've tried to get some good screenshots from the crime scene video of that Star Trek poster. I haven't really been able to get any good ones, and unfortunately in the CBS documentary The Case of John Benet, they didn't really bother to replicate the movie posters. And so I suppose it's worth mentioning the other movie posters in the train room. One was an officer and a gentleman, and interestingly there's not a practice note, but a sample of Patsy's handwriting where she refers to two gentlemen, apparently in her own the way of expressing things. And then the other thing just to mention is that there were 3 other movie posters. One was Somewhere in Time, another one was The Devil at 4 o'clock, and then also overlooking the train room, Death on the Nile. And if you look quite on the, I think it's the sort of a counter beneath that particular movie poster on the shelf, I guess. It's kind of just cut out of that particular image, but there's a can of soda, and there are actually a couple of cans of soda in the basement and also in a basin, but I will talk about those at a later date. What I want to draw your attention to is I spent quite a long time, actually quite a few hours, trying to locate a phrase in one of these films that sounded something like, "We have your daughter." And I eventually found it after a lot of time in the movie Ransom, where the kidnapper says, "I have your son." And I was just looking for something because I thought, was that something that came from someone else, or did that also come from a film? And I believe that it actually came from the movie Ransom. Then there's a very brief reference in the movie Seven to proper burial. And the movie Seven is another movie that came out sometime prior to Christmas in 1996. It actually came out around about a year earlier, in September 22nd, 1995. And there's a brief reference there to proper burial. That may not be relevant, but who knows? And then one of the most well-known references that seem to come from a film, that is echoed in the Ransom note, is that whole thing about do not attempt to grow a brain. And that does seem to come from the movie Speed. And Speed also came out fairly early, fairly long time prior to Christmas of 1996. It came out in the summer of 1994. And that reference, do not grow a brain, is the final reference from the films in the Ransom note. Before we get going with this episode, I just want to remind you that I haven't obviously stopped the Khan's order. The next episode will probably be tomorrow, episode 15. And I've got some other pretty exciting content lined up that sort of complements some of those really interesting episodes in the Khan's order, especially 16, 17, somewhere around there. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, as many of you know, there was a 3-page ransom note in the Ramsey case, quite a long ransom note, something that is very idiosyncratic to the John Benet Ramsey case. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through all 3 pages while listening to all of the applicable movie references. Okay, are you ready? Just a final thing that I want to mention is that in 1996, the movie Crime of the Century also came out, which was about the Lindbergh kidnapping. So you can imagine that kidnapping, ransom notes, all of this could have been in the mind of the people surrounding the events that Christmas night.
Mr. Mullen?
Hello.
Mr. Stone, listen very carefully.
Now listen to me carefully.
Who are you with? What faction?
There's a new faction that wants to prevent your launch tomorrow morning.
I have your son.
We have kidnapped your wife. We have no qualms about killing and will do so at the slightest provocation.
I want $2 million. No consecutive serial numbers. No new bills. No marked bills. The money will fit into 2 Samsonite hardshell suitcases, model number 260.
You are to obtain a new black American Tourister briefcase, model number 8104. In it, you will place $500,000 in unmarked, non-sequentially numbered $100 bills. Monday morning at 11 a.m., you will proceed with case in hand to Hope Street Plaza and wait for a phone to ring. You will receive further instructions then.
You sound like you had a good rest. You'll need it.
If you deviate from our instructions in any way whatsoever, she will be killed.
Giving them a proper burial.
You so much as remove your wristwatch, your your son dies.
You will be watched at all phases of execution. If anyone is with you, or if any action is not carried out to our complete satisfaction, it will be considered an infraction of the rules, and your wife will be killed.
Do not involve the police or the FBI. If you do, I will kill him.
If you notify the police, your wife will be killed. If you notify the media, she will be killed.
If I even think you're being followed, the girl dies. If you talk to anyone, I don't care if it's a Pekingese pissing against a lamppost, the girl dies. The girl dies.
Do not inform the media, or I will kill him. No tracking devices in the money or the cases, or I will kill him. You have 48 hours to get the money. I will contact you.
Do not attempt to grow a brain.
So you may have been distracted by the audio credits, but the reason I did that, well, firstly was just to credit the relevant media, but also to show just how many references there are to the movies that we've spoken about in the ransom notes, especially the first 2 pages. The last page essentially just has one reference, and then I think some of the closing sentiments are from the writer's own imagination, especially the last sentences, dealing with common sense and SBTC. Now we're going to listen to it all again. What I want you to concentrate on is, first of all, the reference in quite a few of these films. I haven't played a clip from Nick of Time, but there's also a reference to the person's name as Mr. And so you have Mr. Stone, Mr. Mullen, and that is the same reference used, the same salutation in the ransom note, Mr. Ramsey. There's listen carefully, listen very carefully, and then the chronology is quite interesting. How it talks about who are you? Well, we are this, and we have your daughter, or we have your son, or we have your wife, and then the threat that follows that, and then there's the instruction to withdraw a sum of money, something about a suitcase, and then something about going to the bank. Now, bear in mind, in a real situation, it would be, we've got your daughter, send us the money, we'll call you tomorrow, like 3 lines, right? But for the purposes of television or cinema, it needs to be dramatized, it needs to be drawn out. And so someone has taken their cue from a dramatization, and that is why they've gotten it so badly wrong. One part that I do find very interesting on the second page or the middle page of the ransom note is the references to tracking devices in the movie Ransom. That movie came out in November 1996. It's very likely a lot of people in Boulder saw that movie, and there's a memorable scene where the kidnapper asks Mr. Mullen to dive into a swimming pool, and that is going to get rid of tracking devices. And you have the same sort of elaborate scenario going on. You also have double dealing. You have a police officer who's actually the kidnapper in the one thing in the movie Ransom, and in the movie Ruthless People you actually have one of the family members sort of in on the whole thing. The husband actually wants the kidnappers to there's quite a funny moment where the guy says, if you call the police, she dies, and then you see a look on his face, and the very next thing the police arrive. And you have another parallel to that in the Ramsey ransom note and the Ramsey narrative. Okay, so let's listen to it again, this time without the distracting audio credits, and try and bear in mind some of the things that I've highlighted. You might want to listen to the audio with a ransom note 2 or 3 times just to get the full scope of what we're talking about.
Mr. Mullen?
Hello.
Mr. Stone, listen very carefully.
Now listen to me carefully. Who are you with? What faction?
There's a new faction that wants to prevent your launch tomorrow morning.
I have your son.
We have kidnapped your wife. We have no qualms about killing killing and will do so at the slightest provocation.
I want $2 million. No consecutive serial numbers. No new bills. No marked bills. The money will fit into 2 Samsonite hardshell suitcases, model number 260.
You are to obtain a new black American Tourister briefcase, model number 8104. In it, you will place $500,000 in unmarked, non-sequentially numbered $100 bills. Monday morning at 11 a.m., you will proceed with case in hand to Hope Street Plaza and wait for a phone to ring. You will receive further instructions then.
You sound like you had a good rest. You'll need it.
If you deviate from our instructions in any way whatsoever, she will be killed.
Giving them a proper burial.
If you so much as remove your wristwatch, your son dies.
You will be watched at all phases of execution. If anyone is with you, or if any action is not carried out to our complete satisfaction, it will be considered an infraction of the rules, and your wife will be killed.
Do not involve the police or the FBI. If you do, I will kill him.
If you notify the police, your wife will be killed. If you notify the media, she will be killed.
If I even think you're being followed, the girl dies. If you talk to anyone, I don't care if it's a Pekingese pissing against a lamppost, the girl dies. The girl dies.
Do not inform the media, or I will kill him. No tracking devices in the money or the cases, or I will kill him. You have 48 hours to get the money. I will contact you.
Do not attempt to grow a brain.